Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode includes honest conversation about mental health, including OCD, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Please take care of yourself and skip this episode if you're not in the right space to listen. If you're struggling, Samaritans are available 24/7 on 116 123 in the UK, or you can find support through your local crisis services. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever episode of Now We're Really Talking, the podcast where we really talk about mental health and dive deep into mental health journeys, mental health experiences, and all things mental health. I'm Paddy, I'm your host, and I'm a mental health campaigner. I've struggled with my mental health for the last 7 years, and for the last 4 years, I've been campaigning to help other people who are struggling with their mental health and to try and prevent people from going through what I went through. I'm so excited to be launching this podcast. I wanted to do a podcast for a long time, but it never felt the right time, but now it does. And this podcast exists for a few reasons, really. One of the key reasons is mental health is often broken down and kind of simplified to statistics and numbers in the headlines and in the press. I think that is completely wrong. And behind every statistic, there's hundreds of thousands of young people waiting for mental health support. Those hundreds of thousands of people are all individuals, all struggling to get by day. And it's so important that we see mental health as more than just a number. If we see it as a number, then it's easy to kind of brush it under the carpet and to ignore what's going on. But I really want to spotlight these stories and spotlight the fact that, everybody's struggle is unique, but one thing it has in common is it's really challenging, and that's what the statistics don't tell us. I've learned so much from my conversations with people. As I said earlier, I have campaigned for 4 years, and those 4 years have been incredible. I've met so many amazing people who have taught me so much about my own mental health, but also about the world of mental health and the world in general. And I've had those conversations. I have those conversations weekly, but it seems to me that these conversations could be really powerful for a wider audience. If they've helped me learn a lot about my own mental health, they can teach other people about their mental health and about what's going on in the world. This podcast isn't about superheroes. It's not about people changing the world. There might be people I interview who change the world, but this podcast is about what it's like to live with mental health challenges. I'm going to speak to a guest each week and really dive deep into their mental health, how it started, how it's going now, what helped, what didn't help, what diagnosis looks like, what recovery might look like, all these things that we don't usually talk about in normal day-to-day life. I really want to put a microscope to and really explore. I think that is a great way for people to learn about mental health who don't struggle, and also for people who do struggle, it can help them learn about their own mental health and hopefully feel less alone. This is about real, authentic conversations that don't usually get the platform. This is about the day-to-day of struggling with mental health conditions. Some of these topics might be uncomfortable. Some of them might be quite difficult, but I think it's really important that people hear what is going on and how much people struggle. So what can you expect as a listener? Each week, one guest, one mental health journey. But it's more than just about mental health challenges. I want to really get to know the guest. I want to get to know how the mental health intersects with their normal day-to-day life. It's often forgotten that, a lot of people struggling with mental health live very, very normal lives and nobody would be able to tell that they struggle. And I want to understand how that's possible. Every guest will have a different story, and part of that is because they're going to come from completely different walks of life. I want to interview parents, grandparents, young people, people who worked for 20 years, people who have never worked before. I want to really deep dive into mental health from all different perspectives. I think that's really powerful and a great way to platform people's stories. So who's this podcast for? This podcast is for those who are struggling. I really hope that it can make those people feel less alone and feel like there is hope it can often feel really hopeless struggling with your mental health. And I want to ensure that people see that there's hope, see that there's chance of recovery. This podcast is also for those who are caring for people who struggle with their mental health. I think it's really, really hard to put yourself in the mind of somebody who's struggling. It's very hard to know what that feels like if you don't struggle yourself. And it can be often very difficult to articulate how you're feeling and how bad that struggle is to people you're really close to. So hopefully, if you're listening and you're caring for somebody or somebody you really care about is struggling with their mental health, this podcast can help you understand what it's really like. But also it's for people who aren't struggling and don't know somebody who's struggling. Mental health is something that everybody has got, and everybody will either experience or know people who experience mental health challenges throughout their life. And I think the more and more we talk about these issues, the more and more we can get it into the mainstream, the better society will become at caring for those people who are struggling. So this podcast is for everybody, I hope. It's for those who are struggling, those who know people who are struggling, and those who aren't either of the first two, who just want to learn more. And I hope that anybody listening can learn more about themselves and also about the world around them in terms of mental health. As I'm going to be interviewing people about their mental health journeys, I think the best way to start in this episode is to talk about my own mental health journey. As I said earlier, I'm 20 and I've struggled with OCD and periods of real anxiety and depression since I was 13. It kind of came about, I started struggling in when I was 13, and I had these massive surges of guilt and real feelings of guilt. And for could be simple as brushing past somebody or saying something I thought was rude or not doing my homework. And this guilt was so overwhelming, I couldn't really get on with anything else. And this would bubble up in me all day, and I'd go in to speak to my mum at night and I'd kind of unload, and I used to joke, I joke now, it was kind of like a confessional. I'd unload and tell her everything that I felt guilty for. And she'd tell me, oh, you don't need to feel guilty for that. You don't need to feel guilty for that. And then I'd feel better and I'd be able to get on with my life and my head would be clear until the next day came around and the process would start again. Things would add up and I'd have to go and confess. And now I look back and through talking to other people and learning more about myself, I've learned that that's called confessional OCD. And it's something that a lot of people struggle with, but I didn't know that at the time. So this kind of continued for a few years. And this is the first time that I can pinpoint having kind of now looking back, having OCD and knowing that I was struggling with something abnormal. But there were kind of signs before that point that I was struggling. I didn't like school. I used to really be upset going to school and I didn't want to go to school, and the anxiety was huge. And I think it's reasonable to say that I've struggled with mental health all my life, but it only became visible and I can only kind of pinpoint it, and it only became overwhelming when I was 13. So I kind of hit crisis point quite quickly, and for a while the kind of confessions to my mum helped, and I, it would clear my head and I could kind of sleep easy. But then one day the confessions, I started going to my mum and saying, I feel guilty for this, and it didn't work. And that was really scary because all my life I'd been able to go to my parents and they would help me feel better about it. And now that didn't work. And luckily enough, when I hit crisis point, my mum and dad found me an incredible counsellor who I started seeing when I was 30 and I still see today. And she, helped me, gave me coping strategies, talked to me about my mental health. I saw her every Saturday morning and she really helped. And for a few years, I was able to cope with that. And, if I felt something really bad had happened, I'd be able to go and see her on a Saturday morning. I kind of knew that she'd be able to help, and she is incredible. And I still feel that now. I still see her every Saturday now. And yeah, this was 2019, and although I really struggled, I had bad germ phobia, so I would wash my hands a lot, and I um, would always worry about kind of turning taps off, flushing the toilet. I remember going to see an international rugby match, and all I could think about was whether I flush the toilet, which is really hard. Um, and the confessional OCD was still there, but it was manageable. I would see my counsellor, and I felt like I was getting better. And then, yeah, so with the germ phobia as well, I would wash my hands. All my OCD has always been about harming other people, always that concern and that guilt around the fact that I feel like I'm harming other people. So I felt like my hands were dirty, I felt like my phone was dirty, and it was never about harming me. I was never bothered about that kind of thing. It was always about contaminating. So touching my phone, and then I thought I touched the table, and then other people touched the table and kind of touched their food. And before long, I was catastrophizing, and I thought that I could build it up and build it up and have panic attacks and think that I'd killed loads of people, which obviously wasn't the case, but that's what OCD does. And so it was really, really hard, but it was manageable up until 2020. And now if I look back and I think, what's the worst case scenario for 2020? What's the nightmare scenario? And it probably would have been a global pandemic, because throughout my life, I'd always worried about harming other people. I'd always been scared about germs and the fact that my actions could kill somebody else. And before 2020, before COVID, this was not really realistic. There was no kind of evidence that I could use to back it up. So although it was really hard, and although I did have the anxieties and I did have the obsessions of harm people and the compulsions of telling my mum and washing my hands, it was manageable. And then COVID comes along, and all you're seeing in the news was adverts saying, wash your hands, stay at home to protect other people. And this was when I was 15, and my life kind of was turned upside down. Initially, when school was cancelled, I was really happy. I hated school. I got bullied quite a lot for my mental health. I had people saying that I was just kind of acting the way I did because I wanted friends, because obviously it would make me apologise and really try and be really nice as possible, and be really nice to other people, because I thought, I really want people to like me. And so I had people saying I was just kind of putting this all on to get friends, because I had no friends. So I was really happy when COVID came along, but within a couple of weeks, the lack of routine, the lack of seeing people, being stuck in my house, really, really got me down. And I remember I went to Aldi to get some groceries, which we were allowed to do. And then after that, I had months of feeling intense guilt that I'd killed loads of people, that I passed on germs to everybody there. And this guilt just didn't go away. I just kind of persuaded myself, my OCD persuaded me that I had COVID and I'd caused all this pain to other people. I'd be looking on Google about the statistics. And yeah, for months, this was the lowest point of my life. For months, it was the last thing I thought about when I went to bed. The first thing I thought, well, it wasn't exactly the first thing. I think people who've been in those really dark moments talk about this. And when you wake up, you have a couple of kind of seconds of bliss where you forget that, you've got this weight on top of you. And then it kind of dawns on you. You remember that you've got this kind of guilt. You're living this life, and then the pressure kind of all came back onto me like a ton of bricks. And I remember the feeling in my chest of carrying around this guilt and this anxiety. And yeah, it was the worst few months of my life. And I gave up. I didn't want to live anymore. I remember vividly looking up at the sky and thinking to myself, I hope an asteroid comes down and hits me and takes me out. I can't deal with this anymore. And I thought I'd never be happy again. I thought, this is my life gone. My wedding day, I'll be thinking about this. All my kids' births, I'll be thinking about this. And that was really scary. And I think the scariest thing was where I'd been able to go to see my counsellor on a Saturday before, and it had helped, and I'd start feeling better. It didn't work. there was no amount of words anybody could tell me that would persuade me that I hadn't harmed loads of people and killed loads of people, which is really scary when the thing that's always helped you no longer helps you. The feeling of utter helplessness and the feeling of despondency and disillusionment with the world and hopelessness, really, that, this thing has always helped me. What am I going to do now? That all came together and played into it. And for weeks and weeks, I'd see my counsellor online and I'd come out of the room and nothing would have changed. And I thought, yeah, this is it. I just couldn't be left on my own. I was driving myself completely mad with the ruminations and the overthinking. And my parents would kind of sleep in the same room as me. I couldn't be left alone. But somehow, after weeks and weeks of counselling, I don't know how, I managed to see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I remember walking out of the room that I was doing my counselling in one day, and I couldn't put a finger on how I felt different. I didn't feel that different. I didn't feel like there wasn't a moment where there was a realisation that I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't hurt anybody. But I just felt lighter. I just felt a kind of a spring in my step. I noticed the sunshine for the first time, and that was a joyful feeling. It was like just simply incredible. I'd never thought I'd get to that. Gradually over time, it got better and better, and then I started it was a weird time because half the time I was beating myself up for what I thought I had done. I thought I'd harm loads of people, and then the other half of the time I was beating myself up for beating myself up. And so it was a vicious cycle. But eventually, as things got back to normal, as we started going back to school, I pulled myself out of that hole. I managed to get out of that hole, which was amazing. And I managed to get back to somewhat normal life through kind of gently putting myself back out into the world. I remember the first time going to the shop again, and I was there in a mask and gloves, and my glasses were steaming up and my gloves were coming off. But, I worked through it, and probably up until about 6 months ago, there wasn't a week or a day, probably a day that went by where I hadn't convinced myself that I had COVID and couldn't leave the house. And there's been so many things that I've missed because I thought I convinced myself I had COVID and I couldn't bear the thought of going out. But, through counselling, and now last year I started on medication. I hit a really low point again last year, and I started on medication on antidepressants. And so when I'd kind of pulled myself out of this hole, when I was feeling better in myself, my brain, I kind of talk about OCD as a bit of a virus. Once it is stopped by a medicine, it mutates and attacks something else. And as soon as I kind of got out of the OCD around COVID, which was still in the background but wasn't the forefront of my mind, then OCD came along and told me and made me feel real guilt for what I put my family through. I thought my parents had been looking forward to having a son, and I thought that I was a massive letdown. I'd ruined their lives. And so I thought, I can't sit with these feelings. What am I going to do about this? Because it was eating me up. And then I also knew the situation, talking to people, and I knew how lucky I was to get a counsellor. And I look back at that time during COVID, and I thought, if I hadn't had my counsellor there, my parents are the most supportive people, and they love me, and they love me even when I didn't love myself. But if I didn't have that counsellor, that mental health professional, I don't think I'd be here right now. When I looked up in the sky and waited for an asteroid to kind of come along and take me out, I think, had I not had a counsellor, I think my brain would have gone somewhere else. And I thought, it's so unfair that I managed to get a counsellor and other people didn't. So I thought, I need to get into campaigning. I need to do something about this. So I got into the campaigning. And since then, it's been absolutely incredible. I've met so many wonderful people. I've had so many incredible experiences. And now it's led me to do this podcast. And hopefully through this podcast, I'll talk to more people. I'll be able to help more people. If I can help one person and prevent one person from going through what I went through and help them deal with their own mental health, then for me, the whole thing is worthwhile. And hopefully through this podcast, I can try and help as many people as possible. And yeah, if there's one person listening who gets some glimmer of hope, learns something about themselves through this podcast, then it's done everything that I want it to do. So that's a little bit more about my story. And from next week, we're going to be talking to other people, other guests, about their own stories, which I'm really excited for. Better than me just waffling onto myself. I want to thank you for listening to this first podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow our social media on Now We're Really Talking. And I hope that you'll join me in future episodes talking to some incredible people. And until then, look after yourselves, and I'll catch you in the next one. Once again, thank you so much for listening to Now We're Really Talking. If anything in this episode has brought up difficult feelings for you, please reach out for support. You don't have to go through it alone. If you're in the UK, you can contact Samaritans on 116 123, or contact Shout by texting 85258, or visit mind.org.uk for mental health support. If you're listening from outside the UK, you can find international helplines at findahelpline.com. Remember, there's always help out there, and talking about it is a strength, not a weakness.